When Shaquille O'Neal carried a ruined sofa into a rundown Detroit shop at 9:46 a.m. on a Saturday, he had a clear goal. He wanted to personally clean an old house he bought for a veteran support program. Looking at the moldy, ruined leather, the 46-year-old widow went silent. Her worn-out washing machine could barely handle a stain this bad, but she still agreed. She tried to hide a court order placed quickly under her counter. In 48 hours, her shop would be locked up because of a dirty lawsuit. Her ex-partner filed it to steal 30% of her business. Witnessing this, Shaq decided to start a quiet journey to protect the stranger's dignity. He had to face cruel legal barriers, the arrogance of high-class lawyers, and the proud refusal of the widow herself. With free help from a veteran's legal team, will the giant win justice before her 48 hours run out? And what shocking gift will arrive at her small shop right after? Shaq took the receipt from Sarah Higgins and turned slowly toward the front door. The little bell above the glass rang once, then went quiet again. Detroit looked tired. That morning, the kind of tired that settles into old brick and chipped paint over many years. Steam rose from a manhole cover near the corner, drifting up past a row of parked cars with frosted windows. A city bus groaned to a stop down the block, letting out 2 passengers who hurried away into the cold. Outside, the street was still half asleep. A delivery truck rumbled past, splashing through a puddle near the curb. A faded sign above the shop read Higgins and Son Carpet Care, the paint peeling at the edges from years of weather. Across the street, a man swept the sidewalk in front of a closed bakery, nodding once at Shaq as he passed. Behind the counter, a side door creaked open. A boy stepped out, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. His name was Toby. He was 16 years old, and his thin jacket smelled like flour and burnt sugar. Toby had just finished a night shift at a bakery 2 blocks away. His shoulders sagged, heavy with hours of standing. He blinked at the bright morning light and looked toward his mother. Something in her posture made him stop walking. He saw her move fast, sliding a red paper under the coin tray on the counter. Her fingers shook just a little. "Mom," Toby said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Is that Dennis again?" Sarah straightened his collar with a shaking hand, trying to smile. Her voice came out low and worn down. "You don't need to worry about this," she said. "It's my problem, baby." Shaq's foot stopped near the glass door. Dust covered the bottom edge of the window, blurring the street outside. Her words hit him harder than she could ever know. They landed somewhere deep and old inside his chest. He thought of Newark in the 1970s, of cracked sidewalks and small rented rooms. He thought of his mother, Lucille. Lucille used to scrub other families' floors for a few dollars a day. Her knuckles always bled a little by evening. She used to push his small hands away too, gentle but firm, refusing his help every single time. She would say the exact same words. "It's my problem, baby. Go play," she always said, just like that, with the same tired pride. He remembered the smell of bleach on her apron when she came home late at night, exhausted but still standing tall. He remembered how she never once complained, even when her shoes wore through at the soles. That memory had stayed with him for over 30 years, quiet and constant, like a small stone in his pocket. He glanced once more at Sarah, who was already busy wiping down the counter, pretending nothing was wrong. Her hands moved fast and steady, the same way his mother's hands used to move when worry crept in. The shop around them still smelled like soap and old fabric, mixed with the faint smoke of a coffee pot left on too long. A row of broken umbrellas leaned against the wall near the door, waiting for repairs that never seemed to happen. A small bell hung crooked above the second door too, never quite fixed, always ringing a half-second too late. Toby did not move yet. He looked at his mother's tired face, studying the dark circles under her eyes. "Mom, the account has like $17 in it," he said quietly. "Stop hiding things from me, please." "Go to sleep," Sarah said again. "I can handle this. It's my problem, not yours." Toby sighed and shuffled back toward the small room behind the shop, too exhausted to keep arguing right now. Shaq did not turn around, but something in his chest pulled tight, like an old rope tightening slowly. He stepped outside, into the cold morning air, the sofa receipt folded carefully in his coat pocket. His mind stayed far from settled. 2 hours later, Sarah sat alone in her cramped office behind the shop. Papers covered most of her small wooden desk. The main washing machine, an old Maytag from 2005, rattled and groaned like a dying tractor in winter. That single machine fed her family every single week. She rubbed her eyes and stared at a stack of unpaid bills, each one stamped with a red warning. A small photo of Marcus sat in a cracked frame near her lamp, his uniform still sharp even in the faded picture. She touched the edge of the frame for a second, then pulled her hand back and focused on the bills again. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window, blurring the gray street and the parked cars along the curb. A radio on the back shelf played soft static, the only station that ever came through clearly in that old shop. She reached over and turned the volume down, not in the mood for music or any noise right now. The front door swung open hard, rattling the bell above it. Dennis Vance walked in wearing a shiny gray suit. The suit looked expensive at first glance, but it smelled faintly of cheap cologne sprayed on too thick. Behind him walked a tall man in a dark wool coat, carrying a thick leather folder. His name was Julian Sterling. Dennis dropped the folder onto Sarah's desk, without asking, knocking over a small cup of cold coffee. Julian spoke first, his voice calm, smooth, and cold as ice on a winter morning. "Mrs. Higgins, you owe a balance of $12,500, he said. "Pay it now, or sign over 30% of this shop, within 48 hours. If you do neither," he added flatly, "the court will seal this property on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Dennis leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "Sarah, you can't keep this place running," he said. "Marcus is gone. Face it already, before you lose everything." Sarah's hands tightened around her pen until her knuckles turned pale white. "Dennis, you pulled your money out 2 years ago," she said sharply. "This shop is my husband's sweat. It is not yours to take from us." Dennis rolled his eyes and glanced around the small office, like he was already imagining new paint on the walls. "Sentiment doesn't pay bills, Sarah," he muttered, picking up a stray pen from her desk and clicking it twice. Julian slid a single page across the desk, his expression never changing once. "The clock starts now," he said, then turned and walked out, without another single word. Dennis followed him slowly, but paused at the door for one last look back. His eyes carried quiet, ugly confidence. Sarah sat alone, after they left, staring at the folder like it might bite her if she touched it. She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out an old photo of Marcus in his uniform. She stared at his smile for a long moment, wishing he could tell her exactly what to do next. She glanced through her office window at the old washing machine, still rattling away in the next room. 48 hours, she thought, did not feel like nearly enough time to save everything she had left. A few blocks away, Shaq sat inside his custom Ford F-350, parked quietly along a side street. His knees pressed hard against the dashboard. Even with the truck's extra room built just for him, his body barely fit inside comfortably. He opened his wallet and stared at his black cards, turning one slowly between two large fingers. They felt heavy and strangely useless in his hand at that exact moment. He set the wallet down on the passenger seat and looked out at the gray Detroit sky through the windshield. A few pigeons pecked at crumbs near a bus stop, unaware of the tall man watching them from his truck. He thought about all the contracts he had signed over the years, the deals worth millions of dollars. None of that paperwork had ever felt as important as the look on Sarah's face that morning. His mind kept circling back to the thin woman behind that counter, her shoulders stiff with worry she tried hard to hide. She reminded him of every proud, exhausted worker he had ever met in his entire life. He remembered standing in line with his mother at a grocery store, watching her count coins twice before paying. He remembered the shame on her face when the cashier sighed, and the pride she still refused to lose. Years later, after his first big contract, he tried to buy her a new house outright, no questions asked. She refused at first, telling him she had not earned a house that large with her own two hands. He had to convince her for almost a month before she finally agreed to move in. That lesson stuck with him every time he thought about helping someone who had never asked for charity. He did not want to throw money at Sarah's problem like a careless solution. That kind of help could crush a person's pride instead of lifting it gently. He picked up his phone and scrolled until he found a number he trusted completely. "Arthur, I need you to look into a shop called Higgins and Son," Shaq said. "It's in Detroit. Do this quietly," he added. "Don't use my name yet. Not until we know more." Arthur Pendleton was the lead attorney for a veterans housing fund based in Michigan. Shaq had quietly supported that fund for years, never once putting his own name on it. "I'll call you back within the hour," Arthur said, already typing fast on his laptop keys. Shaq ended the call and leaned back against the seat, the truck still parked along the quiet curb. His thoughts kept moving in slow circles around one tired mother and her exhausted teenage son. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Arthur called back with real answers, his voice sharp and serious. "Shaq, I found her file," Arthur said. Sergeant Marcus Higgins died in Helmand, Afghanistan, back in 2011. The small payout from his service went straight into medical bills, Arthur continued. Toby was very sick as a baby. That money disappeared fast, almost overnight. Shaq closed his eyes for a second, picturing a young widow alone, with a sick baby and an empty bank account. He pictured the folded flag that probably sat somewhere in Sarah's house, kept safe in a drawer she rarely opened. He pictured Toby as a small, sick toddler, too young to understand why his father never came home again. Arthur kept talking, his words careful and precise. He explained more about Dennis Vance, describing a pattern that stretched back several years across the city. "He builds a habit out of targeting struggling small businesses," Arthur said, "especially ones run by widows, with no legal backup. He's done this 3 times before in this city alone," Arthur added. Each time, the owner gave up before the fight even started. "He uses old handshake deals from years ago," Arthur added. "Nothing written down anywhere. Then his lawyers twist the gaps to force a sale. Legally, it looks clean on paper," Arthur warned. "Without solid proof, Sarah has almost no real defense left in court. These men move carefully," Arthur added. "They know exactly how far the law will let them push before anyone notices." Shaq's jaw tightened slowly. He thought again about a soldier who never made it home alive. He thought about a widow left to fight powerful men completely alone, with no money for a real lawyer. "We don't react with anger, Arthur," Shaq said quietly. "We answer with the truth. Find every piece of it you can." Arthur agreed without hesitation. He promised to dig through every tax record connected to Dennis Vance, going back years if needed. Somewhere in those old, boring papers, a small crack had to exist. He just needed to find it fast. Sunday morning came cold and gray over Detroit, fog rolling low along the empty streets. Sarah arrived at the shop before sunrise. She wanted to finish a special order before the city woke up properly around her. She had promised to clean an old leather sofa by hand for a stranger who paid extra the day before. The shop felt colder than usual, without the machines running, the silence making every small sound feel louder. She pulled her sleeves up past her elbows and knelt down beside the old sofa cushions. She grabbed a stiff brush and knelt beside the sofa, working slow strokes across the rotted, moldy fabric. Her back ached from the awkward position, but she kept going anyway, focused completely on the work. Suddenly, the water stopped flowing from the tap behind her, the pipes going silent without warning. She turned the handle twice, confused, before realizing something outside had gone seriously wrong. A city worker stood outside near the meter, checking numbers on a clipboard, with a bored expression. He explained that a temporary order had cut off the shop's utilities completely, effective that very morning. The plaintiff requested it, he said, to protect the property, while the legal dispute remained unresolved. Toby came running from the back room, fists clenched tight, and his face red with fury. "Mom, I'm calling the cops on this guy right now," he said, already reaching for his phone. His hands were shaking too, though from anger instead of exhaustion. Sarah grabbed his arm and held him back firmly, her grip stronger than her tired body suggested. "Toby, stop," she said sharply. Don't give them a reason to call the police on us instead. I can handle this myself, she added, though her hands shook badly as the words left her mouth. The worker finished his notes and left without another word, climbing back into his city van. Sarah stood alone in the quiet shop afterward, breathing hard, her chest tight, with frustration and fear. She walked outside and filled old plastic buckets, with rainwater collected in a barrel near the back wall. Then she carried the heavy buckets back inside, one at a time, her arms trembling slightly. She returned to scrubbing the sofa by hand, one slow and careful stroke after another, fighting exhaustion. Her fingers turned raw and red by the time the sun finally rose fully over the rooftops. The deadline kept ticking closer, with every single passing hour, a quiet pressure she could almost hear. Shaq returned to the shop, through the back alley around mid-morning, his boots quiet on the wet pavement. He ducked low under the narrow doorway, careful not to knock his head against the frame. He saw Sarah hunched, over the sofa, surrounded by half-empty buckets of cloudy rainwater. Her shoulders shook slightly from pure exhaustion. Without a word, he stepped forward and lifted the heavy sofa easily, with one massive arm. He held it steady at an angle, so she could clean the bottom edge, without straining her back. Sarah looked up at the tall stranger, startled by the sudden and unexpected help beside her. Her voice came out tired, but still firm, refusing to sound weak in front of anyone. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I'll still finish it on time, like I promised." Shaq set the sofa down gently on its wooden legs and met her eyes for a long moment. "I once knew a woman who worked in the dark just like this," he said quietly. "She never gave up, not even once in her whole life." "I can't give up either," Sarah replied softly, wiping a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "I still have a son to raise." "That's the only reason worth fighting for," Shaq said quietly, almost to himself. Something passed between them in that quiet, dim moment, two people from very different worlds standing close together. The buckets steamed faintly in the cold air, and the smell of wet leather hung heavy around them both. Outside, a dog barked twice down the street, then went quiet again, leaving only the sound of dripping water. Sarah glanced at the stranger's hands, rough in places, but careful with every movement he made. She wondered, just for a second, who had raised a man this size to move so gently. Neither one said much more after that. The only sound left was dripping water and the distant hum of traffic. Shaq picked up a second bucket and helped carry water without being asked twice. Sarah let him help, too tired and too proud to keep arguing about something so small right now. Later that afternoon, a man in a neat gray suit walked through the front door of the shop. He introduced himself as Arthur Pendleton, an attorney representing veteran families completely free of charge. Sarah's first instinct was suspicion, her arms crossing tightly over her chest as she studied his face. She had already met too many men in suits who hid extra costs behind kind smiles. "This isn't a trick," Arthur said gently, holding out a folded letter toward her with steady hands. He handed her an official letter from the Michigan Veterans Support Fund, printed on thick official paper. The letter explained that an anonymous donor had already covered every legal cost involved in her case completely. Sarah read the letter twice, her eyes scanning each line carefully before she allowed herself to believe it. "Why would anyone do this?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly near the end. "My husband died 15 years ago." Arthur looked at her with quiet, steady respect, his expression calm and sincere. "Because soldiers who gave everything are never forgotten, Mrs. Higgins," he said softly. "Not by people who remember." He opened his laptop on her cluttered desk and began searching old tax filings linked to Dennis Vance. He started with records from 2018, scrolling slowly through page after page of dense financial language. "There's usually a mistake somewhere," Arthur said, almost to himself. "Men like him get greedy and sloppy eventually." He pulled his sleeves up and cracked his knuckles, the way he always did before a long stretch of work. He scrolled past page after page of old bank statements, business filings, and faded receipts from years before. Every few minutes, he stopped and circled a number with his pen, then kept moving forward through the stack. Sarah brought him a cup of coffee, without asking, setting it quietly beside his laptop on the cluttered desk. Sarah watched him work in silence, hope slowly creeping into a heart that had grown used to disappointment. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to sit down and simply breathe for a moment. She watched the steam rise from her own cup of coffee, untouched and slowly going cold beside her. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the street shiny and quiet under a pale afternoon sky. Arthur kept working long after the sun started to dip lower behind the rooftops across the street. He printed a few pages and slid them into a folder, nodding slightly to himself as he worked. Monday arrived fast, bringing with it the final hour of the 48-hour deadline she had been dreading. Sarah stood outside the Wayne County Courthouse, room 302, her stomach twisted tight with nerves. The cold morning wind pushed against her thin coat as she climbed the wide stone steps slowly. A line of people waited near the metal detectors, their faces blank and tired in the early light. Sarah checked her watch twice, even though she already knew exactly what time it was. Her stomach growled quietly, reminding her she had skipped breakfast again, too nervous to eat anything at all. Inside, the courtroom smelled like old wood polish and stale paper stacked along every wall. Dennis sat beside Julian Sterling near the front, leaning back with a relaxed, confident smirk on his face. Sterling stood and addressed the judge with sharp, polished words, his voice filling the quiet room easily. "Your Honor, the defendant lacks the financial means to keep this business running," he said. "Sealing the property today protects my client's rightful interests." Sarah gripped the edge of her old coat tightly, her knuckles turning white once again. She glanced sideways at Dennis, who refused to even look in her direction. Her petition for more time sat ignored on the corner of the judge's wide wooden desk. The judge nodded slowly, reaching for his pen, ready to sign the sealing order without much more thought. Time felt like it had completely run out, every second stretching painfully long inside that cold room. Sarah closed her eyes for a second, bracing herself for the sound of the pen hitting paper. She thought about Toby waiting at home, probably pacing the kitchen floor and checking his phone every few minutes. Then the heavy courtroom door creaked open loudly, the sound echoing off the high ceiling above. Every head in the room turned at once, curious about who would interrupt such a serious moment. A bailiff near the side wall straightened up fast, unsure whether to step forward or simply watch. Whispers spread quickly through the gallery, people leaning toward each other to confirm what their eyes were telling them. Shaq walked in wearing a simple black suit, tailored but quiet in style, with no flashy details at all. He carried no bodyguards and made no noise as he moved toward the back row of seats. His towering height filled the doorway completely, blocking most of the light from the hallway behind him. The entire courtroom fell silent in an instant, every conversation stopping mid-sentence around the room. The judge looked up sharply, recognizing the famous face connected to several charity funds across the state. Arthur seized the moment immediately, rising from his seat, with a fresh document held firmly in his hand. He stepped forward and placed the new paper directly on the judge's desk for review. "Your Honor, I present Mr. Vance's 2019 federal tax filing," Arthur said firmly. In it, he declared total loss and gave up all ownership claims to this shop. "If Mr. Vance told the federal government he had no stake in this business," Arthur continued, "then today's lawsuit is fraud against this very court." Dennis's face drained of all color almost instantly, his confident smirk vanishing completely from view. He gripped the edge of the table, his fingers pressing wide against the wood. Sterling flipped quickly through his own papers, searching for words that simply would not come to him. The judge studied the new evidence carefully, his expression shifting from calm to hard and serious. "This changes everything," the judge said slowly. "I'm dismissing this case immediately, and I'm referring Mr. Vance to federal tax investigators for review." Gasps spread quietly through the small courtroom, several people leaning forward in their seats. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears forming quickly at the edges of her wide, disbelieving eyes. Outside the courtroom doors, Dennis stormed into the hallway, his face pale and tight with sudden rage. He spotted Sarah standing near the elevators, still trying to process everything that had just happened. He stepped toward her fast, opening his mouth to throw one last bitter threat her way. Then a massive figure stepped between them, without a single sound, blocking the hallway completely. Shaq simply stood there, calm and still, his shadow stretching far across the polished floor. Dennis looked up slowly, his eyes widening, as recognition finally hit him hard and fast. He realized exactly whose shadow had been protecting Sarah all along, from the very beginning. His legs seemed to lose their strength suddenly, and he took a stumbling step backward. He could not find a single word to say in that frozen, embarrassing moment. Shaq leaned down slightly, his voice low, steady, and impossible to ignore. "Being kind doesn't cost a thing, friend," he said simply, his eyes never leaving Dennis's pale face. Dennis said nothing in return. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, with Sterling close behind him, both moving fast toward the exit. A few people in the hallway stepped aside quickly, sensing something important had just happened right in front of them. Arthur caught up with Sarah a moment later, his face still flushed with the excitement of victory. "It's over, Mrs. Higgins," he said softly. "You don't have to be afraid of him anymore." Sarah stood frozen for a moment, watching the two men vanish down the busy hallway completely. Relief washed over her tired body all at once, almost knocking her off balance where she stood. She leaned against the cool marble wall for a second, letting her racing heart slow back down. A small coffee shop sat across the street from the courthouse, its windows fogged from the morning chill. Sarah walked in, with Arthur still shaking slightly from everything that had just happened inside that courtroom. They sat down at a small table near the window, steam rising slowly from 2 cups of coffee. Sarah wrapped both hands around her cup, grateful for the warmth after such a long, cold morning. She kept glancing at the courthouse across the street, still half expecting Dennis to come storming back outside. She turned to Arthur, desperate for one clear answer to the question burning inside her chest. "Arthur, please tell me, who is really behind all of this?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur smiled gently and pointed out the window toward a large truck idling quietly at the curb. Sarah walked outside slowly, her steps careful, approaching the truck with growing curiosity and nervous energy. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing the same tall stranger from her shop 2 days earlier. Her eyes filled with tears again as she searched for the right words to say to him. "Why would someone like you spend so much time on a small shop in Detroit?" she asked softly. Shaq looked at her for a long, quiet moment before answering carefully, choosing his words with care. "I once made a promise about respecting people who work hard with their hands," he said. "My mother taught me that a long time ago." He did not offer her any cash. He already knew, somehow, that she would refuse it without hesitation. Instead, he offered her something different, something that matched her pride and her skill completely. "Mrs. Higgins, you clean a sofa better than anyone I've ever seen in my life," Shaq said. "I need someone with hands like yours. I run a chain of veteran housing across Michigan," he continued. "I want your shop to handle all of it, starting now." "You would trust me with something that big?" Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. "I trust hands that don't quit," Shaq said simply. "That's all I ever needed to see." Sarah stared at him, stunned into silence for several long seconds, the offer too large to fully understand. Her mind raced through the numbers, the contracts, and the simple disbelief that any of this was real. 2 days later, exactly 48 hours after the courtroom victory, a large blue truck pulled up outside the shop. 3 workers climbed out quickly and began unloading heavy equipment onto the cracked sidewalk below. They carried in 2 brand new commercial washers and dryers, gleaming silver under the bright morning light. Each machine cost $24,500, far more than anything the shop had ever owned before. Neighbors from nearby shops stepped outside to watch, whispering among themselves about the sudden, surprising delivery. One of the workers wiped down the steel surface gently, making sure every machine looked perfect before leaving. Sarah stood in the doorway, with her arms crossed, still half convinced she was dreaming the whole scene. Toby ran outside first, eyes wide at the sight of the massive machines being wheeled carefully inside. He spotted a plain brown envelope tucked between two boxes and grabbed it quickly with curious hands. Inside the envelope sat a signed contract for laundry services, lasting 5 full years without interruption. It promised $150,000 in business every single year for the entire length of the deal. The signature at the bottom belonged to the Michigan Veterans Housing Fund, dated that very morning in fresh ink. Toby read the numbers twice, then read them a third time, making sure his eyes were not playing tricks on him. He carried the envelope inside carefully, holding it with both hands like something fragile and important. At the very bottom of the envelope, Toby found a small handwritten note written in plain blue ink. It read simply, "To Marcus's family. Keep this shop running for Toby. From Lucille's son." Sarah read the note twice, her hands trembling around the thin paper as fresh tears slid down her cheeks. Toby wrapped his arms around his mother, both of them standing together in the doorway of their small shop. "Mom," Toby whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "we actually got saved." Sarah held him tighter, shaking her head slowly, through her tears, refusing to let the moment pass quietly. "We weren't saved, baby," she said gently. "Your father has been protecting us all along, every single day." She thought about all the nights she had cried quietly, so Toby would not hear her, through the thin walls. She thought about every bill she had paid late, every meal she had skipped, so he could eat first. None of that struggle disappeared with one envelope, but for the first time, the weight felt lighter on her shoulders. Behind them, the new machines hummed quietly to life for the very first time inside the small shop. Outside, the morning sun finally broke, through the gray clouds hanging low over Detroit's quiet streets. The shop that almost closed forever now stood ready for 5 more years of steady, honest work. A faded photo of Marcus still sat near the front window, watching over the new machines like a quiet guardian. Neighbors walking past slowed down to peek through the glass, curious about the shiny new equipment inside. Toby propped the door open with a brick, letting fresh morning air wash through the small shop. And somewhere across the city, a giant man drove away quietly, expecting nothing in return for what he gave. He turned onto the highway, the Detroit skyline shrinking slowly in his rearview mirror. His phone buzzed once, with a message from Arthur, confirming the contract had been filed, without any issues. Shaq did not reply right away. He just kept driving, content with a quiet kind of peace. Somewhere behind him, a small shop kept running, its lights warm against the cold Detroit morning. A mother and her son stood together at the window, watching 2 new machines spin for the very first time. Neither of them needed to say another word. The hum of the machines said enough on its own. It was the sound of a debt finally paid, not in cash, but in dignity restored. It was the sound of a promise kept, carried quietly across 30 years and one small Detroit shop. Years from now, Toby would still remember that morning, the smell of fresh paint and warm steel filling the air. He would remember his mother's tears, not from sadness this time, but from a kind of relief words could not hold. He would grow older, take over the shop, and keep that same handwritten note framed near the front counter. It would remind every customer who walked through the door that dignity, once restored, tends to stay for good.